David Thompson had spent most of his adult life chasing the so-called American dream. He worked tirelessly, climbing the corporate ladder, sacrificing personal relationships for promotions, and convincing himself that financial stability was the ultimate goal. He had a house in the suburbs, a car that turned heads, and a retirement fund that promised a comfortable future. But at 52 years old, something gnawed at him, a relentless whisper in the back of his mind that kept asking, "Is this it?" He wasn't unhappy, not in the way that some people are. He didn't have a tragic backstory, wasn't drowning in debt, nor was he escaping anything catastrophic. His life was, for the most part, fine, but fine wasn't enough anymore. The days blurred into one another, predictable in their monotony. He had spent decades following a script that society had written for him. Get a job, work hard, save money, retire. Yet, for all his careful planning, he realized he had never truly lived. That realization hit him one evening as he sat alone in his oversized living room, sipping whiskey in the dim glow of his television. The room was quiet, sterile, devoid of warmth. His phone never rang unless it was a telemarketer or a work-related call. His social life had dwindled to superficial conversations with coworkers and the occasional small talk with his neighbors. His marriage had ended years ago, a casualty of career ambition, and he had no children to visit him on weekends. He was, in every sense of the word, alone. One night, he found himself watching a travel documentary about the Philippines. It wasn't the first time he had heard of the country, but something about the way it was presented, vivid beaches, friendly people, an affordable lifestyle planted an idea in his mind. He began to research obsessively, diving into forums and YouTube videos, reading first-hand experiences of expatriates who had traded the American grind for a simpler, more fulfilling life abroad. Many of them had gone with nothing but a suitcase and a willingness to adapt. They spoke about the warm culture, the slower pace of life, and the financial freedom that came with living in a country where a fraction of his savings could stretch for years. The more he read, the more he convinced himself that this wasn't just an impulsive fantasy. It was a solution, a way out, a chance to reset before it was too late. He wasn't naive enough to think it would be perfect, but at that point, imperfection was still more appealing than the numbness of his current existence. The decision was made in the kind of quiet, decisive way that changes lives. He didn't announce it, didn't seek validation from friends or family. He simply started liquidating his assets, selling off furniture, canceling memberships, and tying up loose ends. His job had been his identity for so long that quitting should have felt like an existential crisis. But instead, it felt like shedding dead weight. His resignation was met with mild surprise and some half-hearted goodbyes, but no one seemed particularly shaken by his departure. That, in itself, confirmed his decision. As he packed his belongings into a single suitcase, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was the most exhilarating thing he had done in years. There was no blueprint for what came next, no corporate structure dictating his moves. It was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. What would he find in the Philippines? Would he regret leaving behind the stability he had worked so hard for? Or was this the first real step toward the life he was always meant to live? There was only one way to find out. David had never considered himself particularly adventurous. He wasn't the kind of man who took spontaneous trips or made decisions without meticulous planning. And yet, here he was, stepping off a plane in Manila with nothing but a suitcase and an overwhelming sense of uncertainty. The thick, humid air clung to his skin the moment he exited the airport, a stark contrast to the crisp autumn weather he had left behind in the States. He had read about this, how the tropical climate could feel like an unrelenting embrace, how the noise and chaos of the city could overwhelm the senses, but reading about it and experiencing it firsthand were two entirely different things. His first impression of Manila was disorienting. The streets were a constant flow of movement, filled with honking jeepneys, motorbikes weaving through impossible gaps, and vendors shouting in rapid Tagalog. There was an energy here that felt both alive and exhausting. The city pulsed with an unpredictability he wasn't used to. In America, everything followed as structure lanes were obeyed, silence was the norm in public spaces, and personal boundaries were respected. Here, everything felt closer, louder, more intense. His first challenge was the language barrier. While most Filipinos spoke English, the nuances of communication often left him lost. People spoke quickly, mixing English with Tagalog and local dialects, and even when he understood the words, the cultural context sometimes escaped him. He tried to order food at a small carinderia, one of the many local eateries lining the streets, but his request was met with a mix of confusion and laughter. Eventually, a young woman behind the counter took pity on him, pointing at a dish and saying slowly, Chicken. Good. You try? He nodded, grateful, though he had no idea what he was about to eat. The food was flavorful, unfamiliar, and far cheaper than anything he could get back home. He had read that one could live comfortably in the Philippines on a fraction of what it cost in America, but he hadn't quite understood what that meant until he saw the prices firsthand. A full meal here cost less than a single cup of coffee back home. It was one of the few things that reassured Haim, at least financially. This move had been a good decision. But money wasn't the only concern. He had never been truly alone before. Back in the States, even at his loneliest, there were still familiar Fasesco workers, neighbors, the occasional casual conversation at the grocery store. Here, he was completely anonymous. No one knew him. No one cared where he had come from or what he had left behind. The initial thrill of starting over was quickly overshadowed by the terrifying reality of having no support system. His first few nights were spent in a small Airbnb in Makati, a district known for its modern conveniences and expatriate-friendly environment. It was a comfortable enough apartment, but the silence at night felt suffocating. The walls were thin, and he could hear the city humming outside cars, distant music, occasional voices. But inside, it was just him. The realization hit him hard. He had left behind everything familiar. And for what? A dream? A vague hope that life here would be different? Doubt began to creep in. Maybe he had romanticized this too much. Maybe he had underestimated just how difficult it would be to start over. He had always thought of himself as independent, but independence was different when there was no safety net beneath you. What if he had made a mistake? The hardest part was the loneliness. He had imagined himself integrating quickly, making friends, finding a sense of belonging. But how does one start over at 52? The people around him seemed younger, busier, wrapped up in their own lives. He wandered through malls and parks, observing but never quite participating. He watched groups of friends laughing together, couples walking hand in hand, street vendors chatting with their regular customers. They had histories here, he had nothing. He tried striking up conversations with locals, but there was always an awkwardness to it. People were polite, but friendships don't form overnight. He tried joining a few online expat groups, but many of the discussions revolved around topics he wasn't particularly interested in: visa issues, real estate investments, dating advice. Everyone seemed to have an agenda. He wasn't here to exploit the cost of living or find a young wife. He just wanted to belong. One evening, after another silent dinner alone, he walked aimlessly through the streets, letting his feet take him wherever they pleased. He ended up in a quiet part of the city, away from the towering malls and crowded avenues. It was there that he stumbled upon a small cafe, its dim lighting and soft music drawing him in. The place was nearly empty, save for an older man sitting at the counter nursing a drink. David hesitated before stepping inside, ordering a coffee more out of habit than desire. As he sat at a corner table, he felt a presence near him. The older man had turned slightly, studying him with the knowing look of someone who had seen too many newcomers like him. "First time in the Philippines?" the man asked, his voice rough but friendly. David nodded, surprised at how easily he was recognized as an outsider. "Yeah, just got here a few days ago." The man chuckled. "You look like it." There was no malice in the comment, just an amused familiarity. He introduced himself as Marco, an Italian who had been living in the country for over a decade. David found himself relaxing slightly as they talked. Marco had once been in his shoes fresh off the plane, unsure of his place in a foreign land, questioning whether he had made the right decision. "It's always like this in the beginning," Marco said, taking a sip of his drink. "You think you made a mistake. You feel lost. Wonder if you should just pack up and leave." David exhaled sharply, as if the man had read his mind. "Yeah, something like that." Marco smiled knowingly. "Give it time. You didn't come all this way just to quit, did you?" The question lingered in the air, heavier than David expected. Did he come all this way just to quit? David had always thought of himself as adaptable. He had spent decades in corporate environments where pivoting strategies and navigating challenges were part of the job, but nothing had prepared him for the sheer weight of adjusting to a life that felt completely foreign. His conversation with Marco had stuck with him, not because it provided any profound revelation, but because it had given him something he desperately needed: perspective. He wasn't the first to feel this way, and he wouldn't be the last. That meant there was a path through this, even if he couldn't see it yet. The question was he willing to endure the discomfort long enough to find it? He forced himself into a routine, waking up early, going for long walks, forcing interactions even when they felt awkward. He started making small connections greetings, exchanged with the woman who sold him coffee every morning, brief conversations with the security guard at his apartment building, nods of recognition from locals who began to recognize the foreigner wandering their streets. They weren't friendships, but they were something. One afternoon, while sitting in a quiet park, he overheard a group of foreigners speaking English. Their accents were varied Australian, British, American. They were laughing, engaged in easy conversation, as if they had all known each other for years. David hesitated before approaching, but the alternative was another evening of silence in his apartment. "Mind if I join?" he asked, keeping his tone casual. A few of them looked up, curious but not unwelcoming. One of them, a man in his 60s with a relaxed demeanor, gestured to an empty seat. "New here?" "Something like that," David admitted. Introductions were exchanged. The group was a mix of retirees, remote workers, and long-term travelers. Some had been in the Philippines for years, others just a few months. They shared stories of their experiences, some humorous, some frustrating, all relatable. "You hit a point," one of them said, stirring his drink, "where the newness fades and you realize this isn't a vacation. It's real life, just somewhere else." That struck David harder than he expected. Up until now, he had treated this move like an extended getaway. He had spent so much time marveling at the differences that he hadn't stopped to think about what it meant to actually live here. As the evening stretched on, he listened more than he spoke, absorbing their advice, their warnings, their successes and failures. There was no single path to making this life work. Some had found jobs, others had started businesses, a few relied on pensions or remote income. But the common thread was the same. Survival here required more than just financial security. It required resilience. Over the next few weeks, David pushed himself further. He started exploring beyond the usual expat spots, venturing into less tourist-heavy areas, striking up conversations with locals whenever he could. His language skills improved not by studying, but by necessity. He learned how to order food without hesitation, how to navigate public transportation without looking completely lost, how to bargain at markets without getting blatantly overcharged. It wasn't easy. There were still days when the loneliness crept in, when frustration made him question why he had come here in the first place. But there were also moments of unexpected joy. Small victories, like finding his favorite local dish or successfully negotiating rent without feeling taken advantage of. Conversations that started as polite exchanges but ended with genuine connection. The realization that, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just existing, was learning, growing, evolving. Then came Aina. He met her in the most unremarkable way, ordering coffee at a small cafe he had started frequenting. She worked behind the counter, her movements quick and practiced, her smile warm but businesslike. They exchanged pleasantries each time he visited, nothing beyond the usual customer service routine. But one evening, as he sat at a corner table, absently scrolling through his phone, she approached with a curious expression. "You always come here alone," she observed. He looked up, surprised by the directness. "Yeah, I guess I do." She hesitated for a moment, then gestured toward the empty seat across from him. "Mind if I sit?" He didn't. Their conversation started simply where he was from, why he had come, what he thought of the country so far. But there was something easy about talking to her, something that made him forget, even if just for a little while, that he had felt so alone. Over the next few weeks, they fell into a rhythm. She would sit with him on her breaks, sometimes bringing him local snacks to try, laughing at his hesitant reactions. She taught him words in Tagalog, corrected his pronunciation with playful teasing. He found himself looking forward to their conversations, to the effortless way she filled the silence that had once felt so suffocating. Then, one evening, she invited him to dinner. It was a small gathering at her family's home, nothing extravagant, just home-cooked food and easy conversation. But as he sat there, surrounded by her siblings, her cousins, her parents who spoke only broken English but still welcomed him with open arms, something shifted. For the first time since he had arrived, he didn't feel like a visitor. He felt like he belonged. David had forgotten what it was like to be part of something. Real, genuine human connection, something deeper than transactional conversations or fleeting social interactions. Sitting at Anna's family dinner table, surrounded by warmth, laughter, and an unspoken sense of belonging, he felt something shift inside him. He had spent so much time in the past few months thinking about his own survival, his own adaptation to this foreign land, that he had never stopped to think about what it meant to integrate, not just to exist here, but to truly live among the people. The meal was simple but rich in flavor. A variety of dishes spread across the table, each one explained to him with enthusiasm. He struggled with the names, his American tongue tripping over syllables, but they laughed, not in mockery but in encouragement. It was a stark contrast to the sterile dinners he had eaten alone in his old life. Meals consumed in silence in front of a television screen, nothing but the hum of electronics to keep him company. Here, the food was secondary to the experience. It was about sharing, about presence. Anna sat beside him, effortlessly switching between English and Tagalog as she bridged the gap between him and her family. She nudged him playfully when he hesitated before trying balut, an infamous Filipino delicacy. "Come on," she grinned. "If you're going to live here, you have to at least try it once." The room watched in amusement as he took a deep breath and finally bit into it. The taste was unlike anything he had experienced before. Arthi, rich, unfamiliar. The reaction must have been obvious on his face because the room erupted into laughter, Anna clapping her hands in delight. In that moment, it didn't matter that he was an outsider. He was here. He was part of this. When the evening wound down and goodbyes were exchanged, Anna walked him to the street where he had parked his rented scooter. She was quiet for a moment, arms crossed, gazing up at the sky as if debating whether to say something. "Did you enjoy yourself?" she finally asked. David nodded. "More than I expected." She smiled, but there was something unreadable in her expression. "You're different from the other foreigners I've met." He raised an eyebrow. "Different how? You actually seem like you want to be here." He considered that for a moment. He hadn't realized how much of an anomaly that was. Many expats came here looking for something: cheap living, easy relationships, and escape. Few actually wanted to integrate, to understand the culture beyond its surface. "I do want to be here," he admitted. "I just don't always know how." Anna studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "You're figuring it out." It was a simple statement, but it stayed with him. The days passed, and what had started as casual companionship with Anna deepened into something more. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, not in the way movies depict love stories in foreign lands. There were no dramatic confessions, no instant, undeniable chemistry. It was slower, built on shared conversations, on moments that felt effortless. She challenged him in ways he hadn't expected. She didn't let him lean into his comfort zone, didn't allow him to use his foreignness as an excuse. When he struggled with something daunting in Tagalog, navigating the chaos of the market, she pushed him forward instead of offering an easy way out. "You're not a tourist anymore," she reminded him once when he hesitated at a street vendor's stall, unsure of how to ask for what he wanted. "Stop acting like one." So he adapted. Slowly, awkwardly at first, but he adapted. He started recognizing familiar faces in his neighborhood. He developed a routine, no longer feeling like a drifter in his own life. He found places that felt like his small cafes, hidden beaches, quiet corners of the city that didn't belong to tourists, but to those who called this place home. But with comfort came new challenges. Anna, despite her warmth, was not without her own struggles. She had responsibility, family obligations that went beyond what David fully understood. Unlike him, she wasn't looking for escape. She was grounded, tethered to a life that required sacrifice. One evening, as they sat on the rooftop of her apartment building, overlooking the city lights, she sighed, running a hand through her hair. "You know," she started, "it's different for you. You had a choice. You came here because you wanted to." David frowned. "And you didn't?" She let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "I was born here. I don't get to leave just because I feel like it. My family depends on me." It was the first time he truly grasped the divide between them. He had come here seeking a new life, chasing freedom. But for Anna, and so many like her, leaving wasn't an option. Her world was one of obligations, of making ends meet, of ensuring her family had what they needed. And that was when the doubts crept in. Could he truly fit into a life so different from his own? Could he love someone whose reality was shaped by circumstances he had never had to endure? More importantly, was he truly ready for the life he thought he wanted? As the city stretched before them, bright and endless, David realized that, for all his efforts, his journey was far from over. David had never thought of himself as naive. He had spent decades navigating corporate politics, reading between the lines, understanding human nature in a way that had allowed him to succeed. But in this new life, in this foreign land, he realized how much he still had to learn. His relationship with Anna was no longer just an afterthought in his journey. It had become central to it. What had started as simple companionship had evolved into something deeper, something that felt real. But real wasn't always easy. The initial excitement of their connection gave way to the complexities of two people from vastly different worlds trying to make sense of each other. She was patient, but there were limits to her patience. She was understanding, but there were things she could not explain in a way he would ever fully comprehend. Their lives had been shaped by entirely different forces, by decades of individual ambition, financial security, and the ability to reinvent himself whenever he saw fit. She by duty, by family, by an unwavering sense of responsibility that dictated every choice she made. He saw it in small ways at first. The way she never seemed fully at ease when they were out together in nicer restaurants, as if she was acutely aware of the money being spent. The way she would check her phone constantly, responding to family messages, never truly disconnected from the life that demanded so much of her. One evening, over dinner at a modest seafood shack by the water, she sighed as she set down her phone. "I have to send money to my sister," she said simply. David looked up from his plate. "Everything okay?" She nodded, but her expression was weary. "She just started school again. There's always something. Tuition, books, transportation." She exhaled softly, swirling her drink absently. "It never ends." He hesitated before asking the question that had been on his mind for weeks. "How much of your paycheck do you send home?" She gave a small, humorless laugh. "Almost all of it." The admission sat heavily between them. David had always been generous with money. He had never hesitated to pay for meals, to cover small expenses when they were together, but he had never considered the sheer weight that finances carried in her world. He had the privilege of treating money as an afterthought. For Anna, it was a constant calculation, an ever-present obligation that dictated what she could and could not do. For the first time, he saw the unspoken question in her eyes. Where do you fit into this? It wasn't an accusation, it wasn't a plea for help, but it was a reality that neither of them could ignore. As the weeks passed, David began to see the cracks in the fantasy he had built for himself. He had come to the Philippines in search of a new life, but he hadn't truly considered what that meant beyond his own experience. It wasn't just about adapting to the culture, learning the language, or finding a comfortable rhythm in a new country. It was about understanding the people truly understanding them, beyond the surface-level charm and hospitality. And part of that understanding meant facing the uncomfortable truths. Not every foreigner who came here did so with good intentions. He had met men who treated the country as their personal playground, who saw the lower cost of living as a way to exploit rather than integrate. He had seen how young women were often caught between cultural expectations and economic necessity, how relationships between locals and foreigners carried layers of complexity were often overlooked. He refused to be one of those men, but he also couldn't ignore the growing tension in his own mind. One evening, as he walked Anna home after a long day, she hesitated at her front door. "You're thinking too much," she said. He gave a small smile. "That obvious?" She leaned against the doorframe, studying him. "I know what people say about relationships like ours. That you're just another foreigner looking for something easy. That I'm just another Filipina looking for security." David didn't answer right away. "And what do you think?" She sighed. "I think," she trailed off, choosing her words carefully. "I think I don't want to be saved. And I don't think you're here to save anyone." That was the difference. He wasn't here to rescue anyone. He wasn't trying to buy love or play into a fantasy of being a wealthy foreigner providing for a local woman. He just wanted something real. But what did that even mean in a place where survival was a daily struggle for so many? Was love still love when it came with financial imbalances? Could two people truly build something equal when their starting points were so vastly different? He wanted to believe the answer was yes, but he also knew he had never asked himself these questions before. The more time he spent with Anna, the more he understood that his life here would never be as simple as he had once imagined. It wasn't just about learning the language or adjusting to the heat or finding a group of fellow expatriates to drink with on weekends. It was about truly seeing the place for what it was: the beauty, the hardship, the contradictions. And in doing so, he realized something even more unsettling. This wasn't just about whether he could adapt to the Philippines, it was about whether he could accept the person he was becoming.